Welcome to the Centre for Computing History in Cambridge. We're here today with Simon Butler, formerly of Ocean Software and many other companies. So Simon, you've been interviewed many times about many topics and walked through your history virtually. How does it feel to physically walk through your history today?
Today was a big shock. I give my past very little thought, but to actually be presented with it in a tactile way, seeing a wall of game titles, it shook the old memory cells quite considerably. It was a very pleasant shock. It was fascinating to see. It's given me a lot to think about for today, and it's a fascinating place, and I'm glad such a place exists.
So can you tell us about some of the memories it's brought back to you, happy ones, sad ones, and tell us about those Ocean Days that this museum is kind of celebrating in a way?
I wouldn't say this has brought back the Ocean Days more than anything else. What it's brought back is a generation of gaming that I had that I'd forgotten about. I still game, but seeing a lot of the titles that brought me to this industry was amazing. Today has been... It's shocked me to think how much I spent on games back in the day. But it's good to see some of those old titles. The titles that have brought back the biggest smile for myself have been a lot of the low budget ones. Rather than the bigger titles, the Oceans and the Psygnosis and people like that, it's seen some of the budget titles that I used to buy in abundance. And I enjoyed them a damn sight more than a lot of the things I worked on.
Yeah, so tell us about working on games and how did you get into working on video games?
By mistake, really. I referred a position at Imagine to a friend of mine. He got the job as art director, hired me to do one job. I thought that was it, and I was off to London to have a long and prestigious career in advertising, and I'm still waiting for that. And so I did that one job, got paid more for that one day than I have for a lot of jobs, for many of the jobs that I've done since. And I returned 12 months later to the industry to tide myself over during the lean years of the 80s. And I'm still here 33 years later.
So tell us about some of the games you worked on then. Where can people see your work?
Where can they see it? A lot of the games I'd prefer they didn't. I've worked on...
Examples?
I won't... Okay, yeah, I'll have to say Highlander. Highlander, it's a knockout, Miami Vice, terrible things from the early days of my career. Games that I thought I'd had enough of, games that drove me out of the industry for all of 24 hours, and Gary Bracey dragged me back in and gave me my first in-house job at Ocean. I've worked on 300 titles plus, to the best of my knowledge. As far as I know, that's more than any other artist in the industry. The one that I'm most proud of is downstairs here. It's Adam's Family on the SNES.
We've just been playing that.
Indeed, and I'll go back to play it later on today. I think it still stands up. I had nothing to do with the design, but I'm very pleased that I was part of a title that I think is still as good today as it was 25 years ago.
1992?
Oh, well, yeah, so 1992, that's 8, yeah, almost 25 years ago. Yeah, there's a lot of titles that I've worked on that I wish that I hadn't, but they all paid the bills. Yeah, as a freelancer, which has taken up the majority of my industry career, freelancer, you can't choose what you work on. So you just do the best you can, hope the people like it. If they don't, too bad, it's another one on the CV.
So people have this, I guess, idea of what an artist is, and they maybe picture pencils, pen and ink, watercolour, oil. How does an artist, so to speak, get their work into a video game? Can you talk a little bit about that process and what you would do at Ocean?
Or
other places.
Where today's industry is concerned, well, even though I'm still working today, I still do a lot of pixel work. I'm very much a 2D dinosaur, pixel monkey. I'm proud. It has served me well. It's also worked against me more often than not. As the industry moved on into polygons, I stayed and painted myself firmly in a pixelated corner. You do the best you can with whatever machine you're working on. A lot of people ask me, do I have one machine that I prefer over others? And I'd like to say no, but the machine from the early days that best represented what I drew on paper on screen was the Spectrum, because the pixels were square. Commodore 64 had fuzzy house brick shaped ones. I'm not saying it was a bad machine, but when you draw something and then all of a sudden the line gets wider than it is tall, it kind of caused a lot of problems for me. Spectrum and Amstrad I really liked. 64, even though I worked on it more than anything else, drove me crazy. You just do the best you can. You've drawn a guy with a nice round head. You know it's not going to look round with pixels, but like I say, you just give it your best shot and hope that it looks okay on screen. Today's games, pixelated games, the resolution's greater, so you can make things look more realistic. And if people want realistic graphics, then they usually avoid calling me because I'm known as sort of the cartoon guy.
You call yourself the pixel monkey.
I am a pixel monkey. Like I say, I'm pixelated and proud, and I'd like to think that I can carry on doing it. I plan to do my own project within the next 2 years, but that's vectors. And that brings a whole other lot of problems, but it also opens a whole lot of other possibilities graphically, and but it's still very much 2D, and I'm proud to say that I'll never go down the polygonal road.
So we're talking about making, you described there a character with a round head. How many pixels are we talking about, you know, in dimensions for one of these characters, and maybe you being asked to, right, make that pixelated character look like Bruce Willis, for example?
I worked on a game for Microprose many years ago that never saw the light of day, got cancelled right at the very end. It was supposed to be a god sim, but it had famous characters in there. The heads were at the most 8 pixels high by 6 wide, and I was taken to task on many an occasion by the art director asking me, why doesn't it look like Sylvester Stallone? Why doesn't it look like Will Smith? Why doesn't it look like Bruce Willis? Because it's 8 by 6, you bonehead. But that kind of problem is not something that was new to me. In the early days when you worked on the Spectrum, 64, the Amstrad, and you're working on movie licenses, and it had to look like someone, it never did. And that's a cold hard fact. Unless you had a character, unless you were working on, and I never worked on Red Heat. Red Heat was by Rage Software, I think. No, Special FX. And they had Arnold Schwarzenegger from the waist up, and they could make it look like Arnold Schwarzenegger because there was him and one other character on screen at any one time. We were doing characters that were 32 pixels in total. So you just had a head and a body and limbs, and you said, that's Batman, that's Bruce Willis, that's RoboCop. And
leave it up to the player's imagination.
Yeah, I think the players from that era had been around long enough, had gamed long enough. I've always said this. The old days of gaming required more imagination than today's games. The AAA games on the AAA consoles, whatever they are, they present you with everything. They leave you with very little to do mentally. Back then, you had a picture of a muscled barbarian on the front of a game, or a beautiful girl, or a horrible alien monster. And then you had these very small pixelated characters, and your mind made that leap from what you'd seen on the cover to what was in the game, and it filled in the gaps. Or you just made up your own mind if you had an illegal copy of the game with no cover. And so that's why I prefer, I'll never go back and play the old games. I don't see the point. But I owe my career to those games, and I think that they required a lot more brain power on the behalf of the player than today's games.
It's interesting you draw that comparison where a modern game requires less imagination from the player. You're also suggesting that it requires less imagination from the artist, the developer, and
I don't
the rest
think
of
it
the team,
requires less imagination from the developer. I do agree in certain respects. I find that today's games follow certain tropes time and time again. The hero has to have more muscles than is physically possible, and he will cover them with space armor or medieval armor, and you will just about see his head and his hands. The girl, on the other hand, will have as few articles of clothing as humanly possible. Bad guys, especially, gangs always have billions of tattoos. They wear gang clothing. Today's games graphically are very cliched, very, very cliched. And I think that it's lazy graphical design. I've always said that if I was ever in a position to be an art director, I would set one test on day one, my first day. I would ask the art team to draw a city of the future and a creature from another world. If the city looked anything like something from Blade Runner, they were sacked. If the creature from another world looked like Alien or Predator, they would also be sacked on the spot.
So this isn't you getting the lifetime award and suggesting your career's over, but you've had 33 years, as you say, in the industry.
Yep.
Which era would be your favourite? If you could go back to one era and just stick there, pixel yourself into a corner, like you say.
I would never go back. I don't see the point. I'd like to keep moving forward. Regardless of the fact that I'm currently between jobs, but that's par for the course for a freelancer, I'd say this era is best. Not as a developer per se at the moment, but that hopefully will change once I get stuck into my own project. But I think this is more interesting than the beginnings of the industry. There are very close parallels because of the indie scene and the online gaming scene with Steam. You've got people just developing games constantly. Polygonal games, 2D games, games with stop frame animation. But I think there are probably more games being released now than there have been since the early days of the industry, and probably more than the early days of the industry, because everyone's doing it now. There were only a select few. And now the bedrock that was laid by those select few 33 years ago,
Including yourself.
including myself, has influenced a vast number of people who would never have considered going into the industry. They're thinking, I can do that. I can create games, or I'm just a creative person. People who are artistically inclined or musically inclined are being sucked into the industry. Coders obviously will go towards the industry because it's natural. People who can paint, who can play musical instruments, find themselves in an industry they would not otherwise have considered. And that can only be a good thing.
And no regrets about the industry you've spent all your working life in, almost?
I was always expected to get a proper job. by my parents, and I'm glad to say I disappointed them.